Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. My name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian David Price. David has authored a number of books, including Winning the 10 Crucial Days, The Keys to Victory in George Washington's Legendary Winter Campaign, Rescuing the Revolution, John Haslet's World, and the Battle of Harlem Heights, 1776. Now, since 2021, David has authored 10 scholarly articles for the prestigious peer-reviewed Journal of the American Revolution and is the recipient of the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution Bronze Good Citizenship Medal and Certificate of Appreciation in recognition for his work as an author, speaker, and historical interpreter at Washington Crossing Historic Park and Princeton Battlefield State Park. David's John Haslet's World, An Ardent Patriot, the Delaware Blues, and the Spirit of 1776 is what we're going to talk about today. So, David, welcome to the Real American Revolution. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Well, how did you come to write this book, and what is it about?
I think the genesis of this was actually my first book, Rescuing the Revolution, which you mentioned, wherein I wrote a series of biographical vignettes about what I call unsung patriot heroes who each made a contribution to the outcome of the 10 Crucial Days campaign, which we've talked about before, that started with Washington's Christmas night, 1776, crossing of the Delaware, and ended with the Battle of Princeton 10 days later. And that was such a pivotal period in the Revolutionary War because it changed the whole momentum of the contest when it appeared that, the American quest for independence was on life support. So Haslet was one of the people I wrote about. There's a chapter in there, short chapter. They're all short. It's a very short book. He was the only, I guess there were at least a couple of things about his experience that drew me to him in such a way that I would want to extend what I had done in that book and write at greater length about him. And one was the fact that he was the only one of those unsungs who actually lost his life in combat. And the other was that what was sort of intriguing to me was the symmetry here, I guess, between what happened to him and what happened to his regiment, the Delaware Regiment, the 1st Delaware Regiment, or the Delaware Blues, as they were known because of the color of the uniforms, which distinguished them from other units in Washington's army in 1776, because they were as I understand it, the only fully uniformed contingent in that army, and they were wearing blue uniforms. So, and when Haslet lost his life at the Battle of Princeton, at the end of the 10 Crucial Days campaign on January 3rd, 1777, it sort of coincided with the demise of that 1st Delaware Regiment, because by that point, his regiment was down to 6 men, including himself. And you have to remember that when it started out in January 1776, when he became colonel of the Delaware Regiment, and it was actually operationalized, it became the largest. By the time it was ready to go, fully functional, by the late spring of 1776, there were almost 800 soldiers in that army, and as I said, they were fully uniformed. They were an elite unit, but because of various factors, battlefield casualties, disease, things of that sort, and some, I think probably a small number in the case of the Delaware Blues of men, shall we say, leaving without authorization. By the time you get to December 1776, late December, after the first Battle of Trenton, Haslet's unit is down to just a few, almost literally a handful. And so there's this coincidence between, in a sense, metaphorically, between his demise and that of his regiment, which would be reconstituted after Haslet's death as a smaller iteration of the Delaware Regiment that served throughout the war. But that, the story of his regiment was also part of what I think made me want to write more about him.
Hmm. Was anyone else written a book about Haslet or the Delaware Regiment?
Yeah, a couple of books. The Christopher Ward wrote I
Hmm.
think what's considered a classic about the Delaware Regiment, a book that's entitled The Delaware Regiment, that came out in 1941. And it is, in effect, a military history of the war, because the Delaware Regiment participated in, I would say, almost every major campaign, except for Saratoga, throughout the conflict, and compiled a remarkable record. Ward, as I recall, does not go into a great deal of depth about Haslet or any particular individual, any
Mm,
particular officer,
right.
in that book. So it's primarily about the regiment. Now, there is a book that was written by Fred Walters about Haslet that came out in, I think it was around 2005, called John Haslet, A Useful One. I
Mhm.
don't particularly like the title, but the book is an entertaining read. It's an engaging read, a lot of good information in there. The thing is, Fred's book, and Fred was a newsman, as I recall, by profession. He relies on a good deal of um, historical interpretation that's not, strictly speaking, based on fact. So, to a large extent, his book is a historical novel. Why he chose that approach, I'm not sure.
Mm.
Maybe I'm just guessing, but maybe because he thought he needed he needed that not non-fictional content, wherein he imagines certain scenes and certain dialogue involving Haslet and others, that he needed to do that in order to fill up the book, to make it
Hmm.
long enough that it would be, a
Yeah.
book length work. And so I wasn't comfortable doing that. I, went in the other direction. I recall that after I read Fred's book, and it was certainly very helpful to me in terms of what I was doing, and my reaction was, well, this is a very engaging read. I enjoyed it. Um, but I think that I thought, and I think that Haslet and the regiment, the Delaware Regiment, deserved to have somebody take a shot at writing a more um, conventional work about them, a nonfiction work. And I didn't see anybody else doing that. My hope, frankly, was that the noted military historian Patrick O'Donnell, who wrote a book about the Maryland Regiment titled The Washington's Immortals,
Right.
which was kind of the Delaware Blue sister regiment. Those two units fought side by side throughout the war. They were maybe the two most elite units in Washington's army. This would have been a perfect book, in my opinion, for him to write. And if he had written it, Hazlitt and the Delaware Blues would have gotten more recognition, certainly, than what I wrote. But anyway, so I decided to take a stab at it, and it was challenging to do that because we don't know a lot about Hazlitt's pre-Rev War life, and we don't know, for example, exactly when he was born. Um, I believe it was in 1727 or 28, but we don't know exactly when he was born. We have physical descriptions of him, but there is no authentic image of him, from the
Hmm.
18th century. I'm only familiar with two images of him, and in both cases, they sprang full blown from the artist's imagination. So, and they were painted later on, one in the probably mid 19th century and the other in the early 20th century. So, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of correspondence that Haslet left behind. Um, so all that made it, challenging. And it's one of the reasons why the book was, or the content is configured the way it is. It's not strictly a biography of Haslet. There's a lot of biographical material, obviously, but it's as much or more about the Delaware Regiment and the
Mm-hmm.
campaign of Washington's army in 1776. And
Mm-hmm.
so I, basically tried to synthesize all that.
Well, is there anything particularly distinctive about Hazlitt, the individual? What separates him from perhaps other leaders with whom he was affiliated?
I think it would be fair to call him a Renaissance man. And
Mm-hmm.
because of the variety of, his formal education and the variety of experiences and he had and talents he exhibited, um, he was over the course of his life, he was an ordained minister, um, then a physician. I use that term loosely by 21st century standards, but a planter. Um, he had his own plantation in Delaware. A politician. He was a member of the Colonial Assembly, elected to the Colonial Assembly in Delaware, and a soldier in two wars, in the French and Indian War, where he was a captain
Mm-hmm.
in a Pennsylvania provincial regiment, and then, of course, as colonel of the Delaware Blues in the Revolution. Um, I like to think of him as a soldier scholar because he had a rigorous university education at the University of Glasgow. He was born in and grew up in Ulster, Northern Ireland, and then he went to the University of Glasgow in Scotland, which is the fourth oldest university in the English-speaking world, and was considered then, maybe still is, I don't know, but certainly then as a prestigious institution.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so he had a university education, which of course not many people did in the 18th century, and in the course of which he uh, pursued the studies that would lead to his being ordained as a Presbyterian minister. Um, he had to learn Latin and Greek, maybe Hebrew too, but certainly Latin and Greek is part of the curriculum that
Mm-hmm.
that he that he studied during his 5 years at Glasgow. And I think I said at one point in one talk that this was somebody who, as an officer during the Revolution, could have ordered his men into battle in Latin and Greek. I don't think there was a lot of demand for that, since, as far as I know, there was a dearth of soldiers from ancient Greece and Rome serving with the Delaware Blues. But the point is, he could have done it. And if you look at his correspondence, as I said, there's not a lot there, unfortunately. But when you read that, you see this was a person, and you have to remember, he gave his fair share of sermons, so he was certainly eloquent, excuse me, verbally, but he was equally eloquent in his writings. And which is why I think it's particularly unfortunate that he didn't leave more behind. What I found mostly in his correspondence was letters he wrote to his friend and political ally and mentor, Caesar Rodney of Delaware, who was I guess it's fair to say, the leading revolutionary figure in Delaware. And he recruited Haslet into politics, got him to run for the Colonial Assembly before the war. Rodney was the one who offered Haslet command of the Delaware Regiment in December 1775, after the Continental Congress had, basically directed Delaware to create a battalion, which was the functional equivalent of a regiment for the Continental Army. So, but you read that, and he's quite eloquent and quite moving in a good deal of what he wrote. And so that all of that strikes you as, somebody who was quite remarkable. And the phrase that keeps coming back to me, keeps sticking in my mind about Hazlitt, and which was, get back to your first question, one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue him more after the first book was from David Hackett Fisher in his Pulitzer Prize winning work, Washington's Crossing, wherein he refers to Haslet as, and I quote, this unconquerable man. So all of that, really made him someone that I wanted to, spend some time trying to get to know.
Mm-hmm. What do you think would have happened had Haslet not been killed at the Battle of Princeton?
I think he would have been promoted to brigadier general in short order. He had, well, shortly before his death, in fact, 2 days before his death, in the last letter he ever wrote, as far as we know, to his buddy Caesar Rodney, he references the fact that he obviously was quite miffed that he had been passed over for this promotion. He says Washington had recommended him, and the nod, Congress had given the nod to William Smallwood, who was the captain of the Maryland Regiment, presumably for political reasons, because that always factored into these decisions that Congress made when it came to designated a general officer. They looked at not just the strictly military criteria, but they also had to take into account these political considerations, like to what extent was that officer's state supporting, the revolutionary enterprise, and Maryland was a larger state than Delaware, and so it was doing more in that respect. So I think that accounted for this decision. But there are two things about Haslet that, by way of counterfactuals, that I suppose, although we should always be hesitant about making suppositions in that regard, I'm absolutely certain would have happened had he lived. One, as I said, that he would have been promoted to brigadier general, and probably in short order. And then two, had he survived the war, he would have been elected governor of Delaware. And the reason I say that is that his oldest son, Joseph, was elected governor twice to non-consecutive terms. In fact, he died while in office during his second term. And three other officers of the Delaware Regiment were also elected at various times during the period from the 1790s through the early, the first couple of decades of the 19th century. So it's clear to me that if Haslet had survived, he would have been the leading political figure in Delaware after the war. He would have been a celebrated war hero. His political ally, Caesar Rodney, would pass away in 1784, so shortly after the Revolutionary War ended. And I think that would have left Haslet clearly as the primary political figure in Delaware. So, if nothing else, I feel absolutely confident in saying that, those things would have happened if he had not been killed. If he had not been killed at Princeton.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you spoke a little bit about the Delaware Regiment before, but I'd like to ask you specifically, what's significant about the Delaware Regiment? What sets them apart from perhaps the other Continental Line units in Washington's army?
Yeah. Well, as I alluded to before, keep in mind, this is a regiment that fought throughout the war. Now, albeit in truncated form after Haslet's death. When they started out in April of 1776, there were well over 700, maybe close to 800 men in the unit. After Haslet's death, a reconstituted regiment was formed, but which served in various manners, shapes, or forms throughout the rest of the conflict. But there were never more than, I think, 300 some of those soldiers. When they started out in the spring of 77, that's how many you had. Getting back to Christopher Ward, who I mentioned, who wrote this celebrated account, this iconic account of the regiment, of the Delaware Blues. If I may, I wanted to read a quote if I can find it. So he writes in his book Forged on the anvil of hardship under the under the hammer of experience, the Delaware Regiment was a weapon which any of the great captains of history would have been glad to launch at his foe, unquote. And then this was in the context of an article I wrote for the Swan Historical Foundation newsletter last year. And so if I can just read a little bit of that. Those Haslet led comprised one of the most distinguished regiments under Washington's command. Acclaimed for their bravery and military skill, they were well disciplined and well equipped, unlike many other units in the ragtag army of 1776. The Blues, the Delaware Regiment, helped save Washington's army by their resolute stand with the Maryland Regiment at the Battle of Long Island. That would have been in August of 1776.
Right.
Then provided protective cover for the rest of the army during its evacuation from Brooklyn Heights 2 nights after the Battle of Long Island. Forced the enemy to pay an exorbitant price in casualties at the Battle of the White Plains in October. Acted as the Army's rear guard at New Brunswick and during the retreat from Princeton to Trenton in December 1776. And then in their final battle as a full-scale unit under Haslet's command at the First Battle of Trenton against the Hessians on December 26, they contributed to the first significant victory of the war in Washington's army. Now, when I say full-scale unit, in that final battle where Haslet was commanding his regiment, what was left of his regiment, they were down to about 100 men out of the 700 to 800 that started out in January 1776. And unlike that elite unit that began at the end of the war, the beginning of the war, fully clothed and equipped, by December of 1776, they're pretty much appearing in as ragtag an appearance as the rest of the army. I mean, this was they had, pretty much left it all on the field, so to speak. And then after that first Battle of Trenton, almost all of these soldiers, except for the 5 who would stay with Haslet, they went home because they thought they had signed up for 1-year enlistments in January 1776. Some signed up after January. So their 1-year enlistments actually did not expire when they left. When most of those remaining 100 left on December 27th. But they figured at that point that, this was 4 days before the end of the year. So they figured that battle against the Hessians had concluded what would be the Continental Army's campaign for 1776, and that the army would then go into winter quarters. So they felt free to pick up and go home. And in some cases, those soldiers and others, especially officers who had left the army before that, some at Haslet's direction, the officers who had gone back to Delaware to raise men for a new regiment to be formed for the 1777 campaign. I think some of the soldiers who left, that remaining 100, a lot of them, probably most of them felt, I've done my share, I've done my duty, I'm going home. But some of them may have been planning to re-sign, if you will, for service in the army in what would be a reconstituted regiment in 1777. But as I said, that left Haslet literally with a handful of men by his side after the first Battle of Trenton, and they carried on. One of the remarkable things here is that Haslet, according to his last letter to Caesar Rodney on January 1st, 77, says that Washington had given him orders. These were written orders, presumably. Given what we know, what we think we know, written orders to go home, join his fellow officers in Delaware to recruit a new regiment over the winter of 76, 77. He could have left before that second Battle of Trenton on January 2nd. But he tells Rodney in his letter of January 1st that he needs to stay with the army. He needs to stay a few days longer. I think that's how he put it. So presumably he wanted to remain with the army until it finished its campaign and went into winter quarters. After he was killed at the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, a search of his pockets finds these written orders that it seems he had not disclosed to anyone else. The orders that Washington had given him to go back to Delaware, that he had delayed complying with until after the campaign was over. And now this may be legend, but there is according to one account, I think this was in Fred Walter's book. Tradition has it that when Washington looked on Haslet's dead body on the Princeton battlefield after that military engagement, that he wept tears.
Mm-hmm. Pretty significant. You've done a lot of extensive research in the course of researching this book. Is there anything in particular that surprised you during your research?
Well, maybe a couple of things. I suppose, how accomplished Haslet was in terms of his, his educational background and his intellectual acumen, shall we say, which I got a sense of from, reading his correspondence, what little of it we have. And some of it, as I said, is very moving, I think. For example, I always have trouble saying this without getting a lump in my throat, but in his last letter to Caesar Rodney on January 1st, 77, 2 days before his death, he writes, these are his words: "If I return, it will be to salute you. If not, we shall meet in heaven." And the other one of the other things maybe is just how much of a zealot he was. And I think that's an appropriate term. I mean, this is a guy who I don't think it was possible to be more, ideologically committed to the cause. I mean, he really, he was a zealot is a good way to put it. And maybe the other thing would be just how, if you look at what he went through the last, as when he was colonel of the regiment, especially the last, 5 months of his life, or 4 months of his life, whatever, in the fall and going into winter of 1776. It reads like the perils of Pauline. It's almost surprising that he lived as long as he did. He came down with a serious case of dysentery on Manhattan Island in October 1776 that pretty much wiped him out. I mean, he couldn't do anything for I don't know, probably at least a couple of weeks. Then he was on Chatterton's Hill, which was the key point of the action during the Battle of White Plains on October 28th. And in his description of what happened, I mean, he came fairly close to having a close encounter of the worst kind with a British cannonball, but he survived that. Then he survived a spill into the Delaware River, coming when the army came back to Pennsylvania from New Jersey after the first Battle of Trenton against the Hessians. This would have been on the night of December 26th, 27th. And I think they lost 3 men that night, which is more than they lost in the crossing, the night on Christmas night. Haslet was almost a fourth. He fell into the river, I think up to his waist. They fished him out. In his letter to Rodney on January 1st, and this is almost a week later, 5 days later, he talks about how he had the piles, which I think is their term for hemorrhoids. And his legs were still, partially frozen, I think, at that point. But he survived that. And in fact, he marched with the army on his, what was left of his legs from Trenton to Princeton in the early morning hours of January 3rd, 12 miles in 5 hours and 20-degree temperatures on his almost 50-year-old legs. And for his efforts, he takes a bullet to the head at Princeton later that morning. But it's almost amazing to me that he survived as long as he did. He clearly, um, and this is true of other officers too, line officers that they were right there with their troops. They the colonels and lieutenants and majors, whatever. They were putting their lives on the line along with the rank and file. And he certainly as much or more than anybody else. But you could say, as I did in the book, he lived long enough to help propel Washington's army into the climactic victory of the 10 crucial days that, transformed the conflict into or launched the revolutionary enterprise into a war of attrition that, culminated in American independence.
Well, besides Haslet, are there any other unsung heroes, probably unknown by most people, who figure prominently in this story?
Well, certainly Caesar Rodney. I don't know if it's fair to call him unsung. I guess he's not unsung, certainly not unsung among anybody in Delaware who knows anything about the history of the state, but because he was a revolutionary dynamo at the time of the revolution. I mean, he seems like he had held just about every significant or leading political office at the county and state level. And he was the one, as I said before, who, basically recruited Haslet into politics before the war and into his role as colonel of the Delaware Regiment at the end of 1775. So, he would certainly come to mind first and foremost. And I mean, there are other officers who, served with Haslet. I don't know if you'd call them unsung. I guess one other one who I'd mention is the Thomas Holland, who was the adjutant of the Haslet's regiment in 1776. He had served in the British Army and joined the Patriot cause, and he only survived Haslet by a few months. He was mortally wounded at the Battle of Germantown in October 1777. But he, more than anyone else, I think, helped Haslet to mold the Delaware Blues as the proficient fighting force that they were in 1776. And so other than Haslet, I think Holland is probably the one who deserves the most credit for, making them into this elite force that was, basically serving as a model, for the rest of the army, and who commanded the, admiration and respect of others in the army and without, and that earned the Delaware Blues the plaudits that they got, even in 1776.
Interesting. Well, as we wrap up, what's the most important thing you'd like someone to come away with from reading this particular book? What's the one thing that you'd like them to remember?
Well, I mean, other than the contribution that was made by Haslet specifically, I think the role that the Delaware Regiment played throughout the war. I included a chapter about brief chapter about the post-Haslet Regiment, because I thought the reader needed that context to appreciate what they did. I certainly wasn't trying to come within screaming distance of replicating Christopher Ward's much more comprehensive account, but I thought it was important. I think it's important for the reader to know that, to understand that, because of the role that they played throughout the conflict. And I guess, more generally, this book fits within the series of books that I've written that attempt to give due recognition to, a bunch of unsung Revolutionary War heroes. And I've tried to do that in every one of my books, including the the one that's in the can now that will be coming out in the spring. Um, so, hopefully the reader will keep in mind, reading these books, the importance of understanding the role that, these lesser known figures played, that certainly, Washington and his generals deserve their due, obviously. But these, and as do the rank and file soldiers, but these officers who are in between, I think that we always need to keep in mind, the role, that they played. And I remember something Nathaniel Greene wrote to John Adams in 1776, where he says something like, good officers are the very heart of an army, or something to that effect. In that, one sentence, kind of encapsulating the importance of officers to the army. And that's something that, we need to keep in mind.
Sure, sure. Well, as you know, here at the Real American Revolution, we're all about focusing on unsung heroes and those people who really made it happen during that period of time in our American history. So, David, thanks so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to see you again and to discuss your book.
Thank you, Randy. I enjoyed it.
Well, to our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with historian David Price, author of John Haslet's World, an ardent patriot, the Delaware Blues, and the Spirit of 1776. A truly excellent book, available where books are sold. My name is Randy Flood. Join us again next time for another exciting interview with an outstanding historian on the real American Revolution. So long for now.